Thank you. I'm Scott Wilcox. I'm the Deputy Director for Collections at the Yale Center for British Art. And it's my great pleasure this morning to chair a session on Anglo-American landscape, which will kind of follow on after from Tim's brilliant keynote lecture. It's been a difficult few days for the special relationship. But you know, in a sense, that's what this session is about, a kind of special artistic relationship between Britain and America, and Tim, you know, Tim's interesting comments on the White Atlantic. But at this at this moment of Brexit, I wanted to just comment on to make an observation that, well, you know, yesterday we were kind of toggling back and forth between the local and the global. This particular conference hasn't really looked the other way. I mean, this session is about, you know, looking from England to America and back and forth, but looking from Britain to Europe, and you know, I just want to mention that, to kind of throw this out, that this British landscape as part of a kind of pan-European landscape art, in which there are, of course, local and regional and national inflections, and of course, the issue of national identity as embodied in landscape is key, as Tim mentioned, in relationship to America. But there are these broad commonalities, and so that's just an observation, because our concern in this session is specifically on Anglo-American landscape, and this European, from the European vantage point, the American landscape provided this kind of vision of, well, this virgin land, and you know, that's of course being willfully blind to the inhabitant, the already established inhabitants of that land, in a way similar to what Julia was talking about yesterday in Tasmania. But this vision of the kind of virgin land provided both opportunities for a sort of worshipful celebration of virgin landscape, and for an exploitation of that landscape. And so the papers this morning are going to address, I think, ways of stock taking and ways of kind of coming to grips with this new land, the experience of this new world. Now, our first paper is by Matthew Hunter. Matthew is an associate professor in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University, where he researches intersections between art and architecture with science and technology in the long 18th century. He's an editor of Grey Room, and he has edited and contributed a special issue devoted to liquid intelligence and the aesthetics of fluidity, which is something we were talking very much about yesterday. He has published among his publications is Wicked Intelligence, Visual Art and the Science of Experiment in Restoration London, which came out in 2013. And he's currently completing a book manuscript titled Painting with Fire, the Temporally Evolving Chemical Object in the British Enlightenment. So Matthew.
Thanks, Scott. American landscape painter Frederick Edwin Church made extended tours through South America in 1853, again in 1857. Church's Heart of the Andes of 1859 is the sum of those travels. Spanning some 5.5 by 10 feet, the picture's hulking form has bred a peculiarly numerate species of art historical effusion. During a heady 3 weeks in April 1859, we read, the picture was seen by over 12,000 visitors, each paying 25 cents a head at Richard Morris Hunt's newly opened 10th Street studio building in Greenwich Village. With a purpose-built frame designed by Church himself, it was shipped to London before making the provincial rounds in Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and elsewhere. By June of 1859, Heart of the Andes had sold to New York financier William Teldon Blodgett for $10,000. By terms of their contract, Church retained the right to void the sale if he could find another purchaser willing to pay at least twice Blodgett's price within 2 years. He couldn't. Simultaneously, Church sold the picture's exhibition rights to the Glasgow-based publishing firm of James McClure and Sons for those 2 additional years, requiring his exhibitors to insure the picture for $10,000. And while he sold the painting's copyright to the McClures, Church retained half the profits from the sale of the print cut by William Forrest and half the gate for the picture's exhibition. In such opportunist, money-minting pursuits, as one art historian has put it, Church was an exemplary mid-19th century American success story. I will let that sink in. But numeracy also pervaded the preliminary Andean drawings that made the lifeblood of Church's studio-confected heart. Consider a quick sketch taken in July 1857 outside a Dominican hacienda as Church journeyed to the Andean volcano of Sangay. Drawn with minimal variation in tone, an outward-facing figure is identified by name, Manuel Cuqui. He is placed in Yehubamba, in what is now Ecuador, dated to July 10, 1857. With grinning visage cocked just slightly to the proper right, the top and bottom halves of Cuqui's body stand in conspicuous asymmetry. Bare feet planted flat on the ground in an obtuse wedge, a headscarf curls over a jet of black hair. Pit-like eyes peep out from beneath a broad-brimmed hat as a thin mustache creeps over an upper lip. Flowing tunic occludes Cuqui's arms and hands entirely. If Church has thus hidden prominent markers of personal identity, if he has reduced depiction of context to the barest arched delineations of ground underfoot, his light sketch nonetheless heaves with information. Cuqui's staunch form competes for visual space with an outsized detail at upper right, a tufted distaff and spindle joined together by a coiling thread. Out of scale with Cuqui's body, these instruments of textile production also appear out of time. For during his first South American voyage of 1853, Church had observed the manufacture of Andean tunics by means that looked positively archaic to a native habituated to the Connecticut River Valley's bustling textile mills, where his father and uncle ran a successful bonnet-making interest. Textiles are obviously a little bit important in, as Tim reminded us, and I say this by understatement. From modern-day Colombia in August 1853, the painter had written this, quote, Pasto is famous for its manufactures, particularly for ruanas, or the native costume of the men. Yet so rude are their instruments that for making their thread, a bamboo stand is used for the wool, and they twirl the spindle with their fingers, unquote. Surprising survivals of the past into the present, those techniques represented to Church a radical asymmetry between labor time expended and market value accrued. Quote, "A fine Ruana requires 6 months' work often, and yet the seldom bring more than $8 or $10. When drawing Kuki in 1857, Church made little effort to stitch his portrayal of a tunic-wearing native into the same pictorial fiction as the outscaled instruments for producing native tunics. Instead, his sketch stages a collision between a figure identified in the present and tools linked to numerical values recalled from some 4 years earlier. And Church had the means to thematize those temporal and graphic gaps between depicted subjects in terms of conflict. In June 1853, Church had witnessed a street fight in Bogota between partisans he distinguished by their competing class-identified garments. So he then wrote to his father, quote, "The city is thrown into considerable excitement lately by a difficulty between the Cachacas and the Ruanas. The former means the better-dressed young men, and the latter the class of people who wear Ruanas." So if a flowing Andean tunic was a metonym for the impoverished supporters of General Jose Maria Melo, who bodied violently forth by their thousands on July 8, 1853, then Church's drawing of July 10, 1857, returns that symbol to its inhabited presence and its means of production. In a rapid sequence of perceptual moves, the painter depicts visible features of a named, placed, and dated individual. Then he links by graphic means the garment dominating the subject's body to archaic means of spinning whose time-intensive manipulation stands in combustible opposition to the market value of their yield, which he could also enumerate. Numeracies like these not only informed Church's South American perceptions, they literally organized his comportment to the landscape in the 1850s. Consider this sketch made off the coast of Maine in August 1850. Here, numbers bristle across an outline contour drawing of a rocky promontory lapped by gouache-highlighted waves. Within and against the tonal values of pencil hatchings, numbers key chromatic information. And we're given the legend at the top where we see 2 white barnacles, yellow, 3 yellow ditto, 4 rockweed, 5 dark stone, 6 yellow and rusty light. Church likely adapted this convention from Thomas Cole, the British-born landscape painter with whom he studied from 1844 to 1846. Sketching Niagara Falls in 1829, Cole had mingled multimodal visual information. Jagged pen strokes at left affect a shaggy repoussoir of overhanging trees and bushes. Those hatches also turn linguistic. The word cedars is visible right here, slanting diagonally toward the depth of the falls. And they also turn numerical as Cole denotes distances within and through the landscape. That crooked escarpment at left stands 200 yards off, he tells us, while the milky floors of the Thundering Falls lies 160 feet below. And here, too, numbers key colors. A prominent number 8 at the summit of the falls signals, quote, dark green water with small white ridges. Now, this is not to deny that precedents for these numerical conventions could either be found in the British pictorial tradition, that, as Tim has just reminded us, Cole knew and admired so well, or in the natural philosophical literatures that Church read assiduously. What it is to submit is that in the hands of Church, these alphanumeric means of producing pictures reach a point of extremity, where, as in this sketch of a splendid sky over Pittsford, Massachusetts from September 1848, the allotment of graphic space given over to on-site picture making is dwarfed by the alphanumeric apparatus designed to denote chromatic effects for future use. How should we understand numeracies like these? Church's act of sizing up Kuki evokes the gauging of commodities, central to Michael Baxendall's classic formulation of the period I, where the emphasis on mass and volume in Renaissance Florentine art is tracked back to mathematical habits of the city's mercantile economy. At the same time, and here changing interpretive direction, Church's front-facing Kuki could be seen to look beyond what Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison have called the purified, self-negating vision of mid-19th century mechanical objectivity, anticipating instead the physiognomic sight of 20th century trained judgment. If we're intent on that kind of matter, we might even follow the genealogy of trained judgment given by Daston and Gallison back to Alexander von Humboldt, the very German scientist who mythically inspired Church's South American travels. Yet all this temporal to and fro between Renaissance and modern epistemes, if you like, equally foregrounds the speed at which Church exercised his summary sizing, his thin slicing of Kuki, that rapid cognitive analysis built from trained expertise, which winnows out maximal predictive accuracy from minimal information base. Rather than rehearsing these kinds of familiar interpretive options, I think there's also a more direct, a more elemental way to cut the deck. For no one would have agreed more with the recent art historical stress placed on the importance of detail in Church's endeavors than the Aetna Fire Insurance Company, an underwriting interest where Church's father, Joseph Church, sat on the board of directors for some 42 years. Convinced that, quote, no business of the aggregate extent of ours is so dependent upon details, unquote, Aetna began publishing in 1857, so the year of Church's Kuki sketch, graphic formulae for converting confusing observations, conflicting narratives made by the actuary on site into prudent numbers. Modeled after this schematic ground plan of a modern town, agents were to make, quote, a careful observation with a diagram of all risks offered in blocks or with questionable exposures or risks, and refer to headquarters to be advised as to the proper rates, unquote. Pictures made in the field would be translated into numbers at the home office, then exported back as the percentage rates for premiums to be charged to clients. By the late 1850s, insurance agents and their clients were putting this pictorial numerical relay into practice. In October 1850, Alan Barnes of Litchfield, Connecticut, signed this form as he secured $300 worth of fire indemnity from Aetna, Church's father's firm. Drafted in pencil, reinforced by pen, Barnes, or perhaps the agent, Curtis L. North, inserted textual responses about the insured building to the form's 12 scripted questions. By 1857, again, the date of the Kuki sketch, the form of Aetna's forms had changed. More than half of the recto of the application for a 3 to 5 year insurance policy was now devoted to a survey to be completed in writing or by diagram. Split off by a vertical band at central left, the blank space for writing or diagramming in this policy has been commandeered by blocks plotting the residence of a Dr. Cox in relation to Barnes, outbuildings, and the highway. That relay of diagrams was not peculiar to Aetna. William Calder Jr. bought $3,000 worth of fire indemnity on property in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1861. He signed this form prepared by the Insurance Company of North America as he did so. The interior retains a vertically aligned questionnaire, but 1/4 of the form's exterior surface area has been converted to diagrammatic rendering, now mapped to pre-printed cardinal directions, which you can see on the right. In the 1840s, graphic rendering of fire risk calculation was an ad hoc affair, one done or not at the discretion of the agent vending the policy. Exemplary here are the mixed ground plan, polychrome isometric projections contrived on unlined paper by agent Matthias S. Richards of Reading, Pennsylvania. But by the 1880s, the Insurance Company of North America, for which Richards worked, had made high levels of graphic sophistication standard, building into its application forms dorsal-ventral differentiation, mixed textual orientation, a complex folding scheme, an expansive diagrammatic space, not only aligned with the cardinal directions, but gridded to a scale of 10 feet per 1 square. In light of these fire insuring graphics, it's interesting to note that one of Church's first annotated drawings, made under Cole's guidance in 1844, depicts a town on fire. As the painter counts up the 30 buildings burnt, chromatic effects are signaled not by the numbers of his mature graphic practice, but by quasi-pictorial signs. The single horizontal dash of pale whitish light, which we see here, or the double dash, an equal sign of reddish, which would appear here in the pictorial world. If quasi-pictorial signs here anticipate numerical referencing, then Church's Yehubamba sketch can be seen to integrate the actuarial drive of risk-calculating graphics into its very structure, shorn of the visible reference numbers crucial to Church's preparatory studies. The drawing transfers into a visible plane the details necessary for an experienced eye to make numerical inferences. Compiling evidence of a named, dated, and placed individual's most conspicuous material possession and its means of production, the drawing asks, how can his future be calculated? Theorist Francois Ewald observes that insurance individualizes. It defines each person as a risk, but the individuality it confers no longer correlates with an abstract invariant norm, such as that of the responsible juridical subject. It is an average sociological individuality, unquote. Manuel Kuki is, we might say, less a person than a statistic, a predictable result of managerial inefficiencies, as Church had then said to his father, or as we might call them, economic inequalities. Seen this way, Church's drawings might enable us to watch a 19th century American landscape painter engaging with otherness, tropical in this case, through techniques for gauging life, techniques increasingly central to the mental furniture of his numerate patrons and audiences, a calculating people, as one historian has termed them. Building habits of actuarial knowing into the fabric of draftsmanship, Church's sketch shows not only finished oil paintings, but the vagaries of human life themselves coming to be made by trusting numbers. But I think there's a larger story to tell here about the ways in which an actuarial sensibility, the material imprint of insurance, had been shaping that landscape tradition to which Church's habits of mind and hand were surely indebted. After all, the horror of Turner's slave ship pivots on insurance. The Zong's improvised crew having cast sickened, manacled Africans into the ocean as a storm approached, hoping to claim back the cost of mass murder from the underwriters insuring the ship's voyage as a loss at sea. If Turner painted with far greater entanglement and the financing of slavery's landscapes than we might like to imagine, as Sam Smiles has demonstrated, then too, the key prototypes of Claude Lorrain to which he, Turner, so frequently looked, had entered the National Gallery through the collection that John Julius Angerstein built by selling marine insurance at Lloyd's of London. Insurance now dictates what art can travel and where it can go. Church consolidates a node in that story, I think. He indemnified not only his life as he traveled into the South American landscape in the 1850s, but insisted that insurance be purchased from the promoters who would exhibit its depiction in the years after 1859. Yet the history of how that industrialization of risk and its actuarial imagination shaped the broader project of Anglo-American landscape remains to be written. Thank you.
Okay, our second paper is by Julia Sankowitz. Julia is assistant professor of art history at Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. And her talk today is related to her upcoming book, Epic Landscapes, Benjamin Henry Latrobe's Virginian Watercolors, which will be published by the University of Delaware Press. Julia.
So I want to join the chorus in thanking the three organizing centers for this incredible conference from which I've learned so much so far, and also to say that it's a real honor to speak to this audience, many of whom have written pieces that have influenced my work. And although this is not in the paper, it seems relevant to note that today I'm speaking to you about the man known as the primogenitor of American architecture, so this nice consonance with Tim's emphasis for Cole. So in December 1795, Benjamin Henry Latrobe set sail from Britain for Virginia. The circumstances of his departure from London, where he had resided for 10 years, were traumatic. He fled both bankruptcy and heartbreak. During his Atlantic voyage, London newspapers would advertise his bankruptcy and the auction of his possessions. Latrobe asserted that he fled Britain after the recent death of his wife Lydia and of his mother shortly thereafter, writing that due to his grief, quote, "I resolved to leave a country where everything reminded me how happy I had been and how miserable I was," unquote. Although scholars are uncertain whether Latrobe planned a permanent relocation, his circumstances were bleak and his possibility of return limited. I imagine he was an economic refugee, this term we have learned today. With little else seeming secure, Latrobe launched across the Atlantic with a fresh sketchbook and journal in hand. Marking the start of his transatlantic voyage, he created a title page for the Atlantic sketchbook, inscribing it with Virgil's famous phrase, "Forsan et haec olim meminisse iuvabit," unquote, or perhaps someday it will be pleasing to remember even these things. And he began creating watercolor views of the landscapes, or really seascapes, that he encountered, with the white cliffs of Dover being his first subject. With a few strokes of his brush, the British artist began painting in a different guise, that of the émigré. Though this view is prosaic, Latrobe accompanies it with grandiose historical associations to Julius Caesar and William the Conqueror, reflecting both on his own intimate knowledge of the history of this landscape, past and present, but also on the danger and hostility of its topography to strangers. Viewed through his own words, his unassuming watercolor takes on the gaze of conquering leader, picturesque tourist, or homesick emigrant. He seems conscious both that his familiarity with the landscape endows him with privileged knowledge, and also of the loss associated with his departure, as his rightful claim to this landscape fades as the boat progresses. In my talk today, I will explore the immigrant landscape as a distinct category within our focus on the British landscape tradition, and one that opens up possibilities both for nuanced considerations of place and for confronting displacement, the immigrant's sensibility of being caught in between two places. For me, this concept has developed as a way of interpreting Latrobe's watercolors in his most prolific years of working in the medium, between 1795 and 1799, with this end date corresponding to his relocation to Philadelphia, which transformed both his professional and his personal activities. While at first glance many of Latrobe's landscapes from this period appear straightforward, my research has uncovered innovative techniques that he seems to have developed in tandem with his journey. I have come to understand these paired, serial, and trompe-l'oeil landscapes as the result of the stimulating and distressing process of immigration. Forced to re-examine his identity on many levels, landscape watercolors offered Latrobe the compelling opportunity to experiment with the meaning of places and to probe the boundaries of the genre in the process. Both Latrobe's status as an artist and the sites shown in his Virginian watercolors offer compelling case studies for testing the parameters of this conference. Although Latrobe was born in Yorkshire and emigrated from London, his status as a British artist is not without ambiguity. His father was Irish, his mother Pennsylvanian, and Latrobe himself was born into and raised within the Moravian community, in which his father was a prominent leader. During much of his youth, Latrobe was educated in what was then called Silesia, now encompassing the eastern tip of Germany and parts of both Poland and the Czech Republic. My research to this corner of the world has proven that it was there that Latrobe was first exposed to the picturesque tradition of watercolor, and where he likely began to keep sketchbooks alongside his written journals and very prevalent habits of the Moravian tradition. After a crisis of faith, Latrobe returned to London, where he eventually separated with the church and began to pursue an architectural career. Unfortunately, the loss of his European sketchbooks makes it virtually impossible to document the nature of his work in watercolor during these years, though some indication can be gleaned from his architectural renderings, including these detailed drawings he prepared for the Moravian community of Fulneck in Yorkshire. Here, some traces of the radical neoclassical architect he would become are visible, as his close attention to topography and familiarity with picturesque composition. And I'll just also remark that he is not the designer of this site, just the person who executed the plans and the watercolors. Latrobe's watercolors have long been deemed unimportant artistically, as the product of an amateur watercolorist with limited intellectual value beyond their documentation of Virginian subject matter. Likely, the ambiguity of Latrobe's biography has also contributed to their relative obscurity. His works fall too early to be embraced within the much-studied Hudson River School, and his own tie to Britain is too opaque to have attracted the attention of historians of British art. Furthermore, most of these works focus on Virginian subject matter captured in the early national period, yet as we will see, they consider the post-colonial status of those landscapes, even as they probe Latrobe's own transitional immigrant experience. Both the artist and the scenes that he represents occupy peripheral positions in the history of British landscape, opening up both problems and possibilities. Most notably, they challenge the structure of art history's fields that are bound to nation-state designations. Latrobe fits uncomfortably both within the British and the American traditions, and his ties to Central Europe and the international Moravian artistic community further disrupt these categories by limiting the viability of the Atlantic world paradigm. We can begin our study of Latrobe's immigrant landscapes through a pair of scenes that he produced during the first month of his voyage, as his ship was caught in the English Channel, a victim of bad weather and the worst navigational skills of its crew. View of coast of the England at Hastings and moonlight scene at Hastings, England, capture Latrobe's emigrant landscape aesthetic. These two views are drawn from his unfinished manuscript, An Essay on Landscape, which occupied him between 1797 and 1799, but I believe the original watercolors were completed while aboard the Eliza. View of the coast at Hastings is dominated by the face of a high cliff. Its striated surface is bathed in light. The scene juxtaposes the human hand, present with boats, a carriage, and windmills, and that of nature. And Latrobe's accompanying text reflects that both nature and humankind have ravaged this landscape, though in this case, the powerful surge has proven the strongest force. Moonlight scene at Hastings presents a sliver of beachfront, which recedes beneath the massive bulk of a cliff. Angled walls of a robust fortress, a bristling array of ship masts, and single house are all dimly visible. This small inlet of human influence is dwarfed by the cliffs, which rise 3 times the height of the tallest masts. The right-hand side is an open expanse of gently rippling ocean. The moon hovers above the horizon and casts a clear beam across the water, leading the eye in a straight line toward the horizon beyond. A large boat, likely the Eliza, bobs to the right, perhaps resting at anchor overnight at safe distance from the rocky cliffs. View of the coast at Hastings and moonlight scene at Hastings are pendant views that, when considered as a set, create a significant and a complex viewing experience. The two views pivot, as Latrobe specifically notes, on a single point along the shore of the coast. View of the coast of England faces toward the west along the English Channel, and from there promises the viewer a course out toward the open ocean. Moonlight scene at Hastings turns the viewer toward the east, back along the route already traveled by the Eliza. In view of the coast of England, the viewer's perspective seems firmly grounded on the sandy beach in the foreground, but having pivoted toward moonlight scene at Hastings, the thin strip of beach virtually drops the viewer into the ocean. One scene is rooted on the terra firma of homeland, while in the other, the viewer finds himself cast at sea. The contrast is further accented by the paired effects across the two views, most notably between day and night, sunlight and moonlight, and the corresponding contrasts of warm and cool pigment. This set of contrasts creates an interesting cycle of sensations. Melancholy and longing seem inherent in the moonlight view, which draws the eye tantalizingly beyond the coast of Hastings back toward the shimmering promise of the moon, back toward London. View of the coast at Hastings, by contrast, appears warm and peaceful, contented in its own existence, bathed in the light of a sunny day, in a pronounced effect of warm light that Latrobe specifically noted he created for effect. Latrobe's text further emphasizes the inhospitable nature of this shoreline to the stranger. Once departed from Britain, it is difficult to return. A stranger would be just as likely to crash on the rocky coast as to enjoy its shelter and welcome. Moonlight seen at Hastings conveys anticipation in its stillness and longing in the silver light of the moon, appropriate for the emigrant viewer given its homeward bound orientation. This association is tempered, though, by the sensation that the moonlight pulls the viewer out across the open water toward an unseen destination beyond the horizon, seeming to beckon toward distant lands across the sea. Once landed in Virginia, Latrobe employed this technique of pendant landscapes on multiple occasions, though perhaps most strikingly in Richmond. In a lengthy diary entry, he described the sensation of visiting cities in the New World that shared names with places he had known in the Old. Of all the sites in Virginia, Richmond most captured Latrobe's fancy because, as he remarked, it was only there that he felt himself home again in England. He found the likeness between the twin Richmonds so striking that he mused, quote, "If a man could be imperceptibly and in an instant conveyed from the one side of the Atlantic to the other, he might hesitate for some minutes before he could discover the difference," unquote. Despite the imaginative fancy of this statement, Latrobe sought to describe a real sensation of place and space, and he attempted to capture this sensibility in his landscape views. In its placid beauty, View of Richmond presents the landscape characteristics that Latrobe attributed to the British Richmond in his lengthier passage: undulating hills, carefully coiffed landscape, and brilliant white classicism. Sketch of Washington's Island, by contrast, offers a vista that appears untouched by human hand, save for two African-American boatmen. The James River flows rapidly across the painting, pushed forward by the force of the falls, and the trees and foliage are scraggly, a continuous solid mass. Yet if one scene seems British and the other American, they both render Latrobe's new home in Virginia. The views, which are so different in their characterization of this location, are bound together by the selective, displaced, and disoriented character of the immigrant viewer. This consistent, if conflicted, immigrant experience is inherent to the construction of these works. If we place the views side by side, we can see that the viewers exchange gazes across the river. The two scenes highlighting the river's water, like the Atlantic, as the space separating the British from the American. In an instant, the viewer is transported back across the Atlantic, even as he eventually realizes the trick. Both landscapes are really American, though one seems a world apart. In Virginia, Latrobe developed this technique further through the creation of serial landscape views, which manipulate the viewer's perception across both space and time, across a number of images. Importantly, Latrobe often signals the relationships among these images through textual cues in his writing. These breadcrumbs have allowed me to decode the relationships in several of these landscape series, though this is something that has not before been recognized. And they are visually challenging to identify, and I'm frustrated to say I still keep discovering these as I complete my writing process. So, Latrobe's three views of Norfolk were his first concentrated study of an individual city in the United States, and they were located adjacent to one another in his sketchbook. View on the Elizabeth River, Norfolk, Virginia, presents a majestic scene of water, tree, sky, and sailing vessels. No sign of a surrounding city is evident, except in the presence of boats on the river. The subsequent sketchbook sheet view of part of the ruins of Norfolk shows the viewer a landscape in ruins. The subject matter is striking, as it immediately seems to denote Europe for its viewer, yet is clearly labeled as an American scene. The pictured ruins are byproducts of the American Revolution, during which the city was damaged by both American and British forces. Although time is not sufficient for me to fully explore this here, it is important to mention that this view meditates on the American Revolution as both a revolution and a civil war, a concept it explores in tandem with ancient sources concerning the Roman Civil War, and on which it builds within the fraught contemporary context of the French Revolution. So there's a lot here in this particular piece. Finally, View of Norfolk from Smith's Point offers a detailed city view of a thriving port. The differences among these views are more striking than their similarities. They comprise a pleasant landscape scene of untouched nature, a melancholy study of ruins, and a conventional topographic urban view. Even more surprisingly, a careful reading of Latrobe's annotations reveals that all three scenes were taken in close proximity to one another. In view on the Elizabeth River, 3 trees occupy the right-hand side of the image. In his caption, Latrobe notes, quote, "The trees on the right hand are those behind which the brig appears in the next landscape," unquote. Turning to view of part of the ruins of Norfolk, the viewer identifies the same 3 trees as the clustered clump of trees abutting the 2 ruined chimneys along the river's edge. Once this connection is made, it is also apparent that the tall sailing vessel and the smaller ship to its left are in both images. Flipping to view of Norfolk, the caption again signals the connection among the landscapes. Latrobe recorded, quote, "This view is taken from the point near the 4 trees behind which the brig appears in the foregoing sketch," unquote. Tied to the visual anchors of a small clump of trees and repeated sailing vessels, these images guide the viewer on a journey, though one confined to only a few steps across a real landscape. Most literally, the differences among these images derived from their variance of perspective. View on the Elizabeth River situates the viewer with the back to the ruins, enjoying an unsullied scene of nature. View of Norfolk shifts only a few steps, but the scene is transformed. Standing in front of the cluster of trees and turned slightly toward the left, the viewer admires prosperous civilization. Finally, facing the same direction, but pivoted, the viewer sees both majestic sailboats and the sketchiest hint of the thriving port here in those masts. As the backdrop to a dramatic representation of the city in ruins. In this series, Latrobe achieves a multifaceted study of place by exploiting the viewer's capacity for displacement. Only by becoming aware of the space behind his back, or by moving metaphorically across time, past, present, future, or geography, European versus American ruins, can the viewer gain a deeper, reflective perspective. A final image can offer a taste of Latrobe's experimentation with landscape in trompe-l'oeil, again, deriving inspiration from his immigrant experience. A collection of small moonlights, which I have redated to 1797, juxtaposes a textual backdrop with 3 diminutive landscape vignettes. This image offers an exceptional opportunity to explore Latrobe's engagement with the social unrest of the Age of Revolutions, and we'll just scratch the surface of this today, and his contemplation of the relationship between the United States and Europe. Here, a central moonlit landscape, labeled Scene at Hampton, Virginia, depicts a small 1-room log house from which a welcoming bright red light shines forth into the deepening dusk. The house sits next to a body of water, which reflects the moon's rays and ripples across its surface. A large boat drifts on the horizon. In the foreground, a rowboat bobs gently in a sheltered cove, proffering safe passage to the cabin. The second vignette is a river scene in which shimmering water is flanked by trees and rocks. A full moon again hovers at the horizon and shines a strong beam onto the water. At the vanishing point, a large sailing vessel turns a bend of the river. The final vignette appears located on the ocean front. A fire illuminates the hull of an immense sailing vessel. In the distance, 4 more ships sail on a still ocean water, and the moon again hovers on the horizon, creating shimmering light on the water's surface. The text beneath the vignettes is a sardonic commentary on reactions to the battles between French and Austrian forces. It facetiously suggests that it has been, quote, proved as plain as the nose on a face, unquote, that the current turmoil will lead to peace between England and France, and accordingly, quote, religion, order, and subordination put upon its old proper footing, unquote. Despite the complex international spectrum of concepts with which Latrobe's image is engaged in this text, the scene at Hampton, Virginia is both the visual center of the piece and the lingering focus of the eye. The minutely rendered cabin is at the physical center, and the warm light flooding from its small window offers welcome, anchoring the image in a sea of chaos and conveying an air of tranquility not reflected in the text. If the vignettes are studied, beginning at right here, following a clockwise motion, they suggest a theme of travel and homecoming. While no explicit geography is given, The flaming bonfire in the right-hand vignette may well be a metaphor for the flames of war burning in Europe, behind which ships and moonlight guide the viewer's eye suggestively across the water. In the next vignette, the ship has implicitly traveled across the Atlantic and sails toward a large river, much like the Virginian rivers Latrobe represents elsewhere, still followed by moonbeams. The final vignette shows the ship on the horizon and moonbeams pointing into the cove. Having traveled a great distance, the passenger can now find his home in this sheltered cove with a literal, even a cliché, representation of the American home. While war wages in Europe and nations are thrown into upheaval, Latrobe's image suggests that travel across the Atlantic leads to another world. Yet, this is a trompe-l'oeil, and the viewer must avoid succumbing too easily to its compelling visual narrative. The stillness and the tranquility of the central scene contrast with both the violent and disillusioned text below and with that insistent circular motion of the vignettes. Placed within the larger context of Latrobe's imagery and his writings from this period, and noting his focus on moonlight, the trompe-l'oeil can be understood as melancholy rather than celebratory of homecoming. Overwhelmed by his own sadness and disconnection from Virginian society, Latrobe dreamed of the hermit's lifestyle, even purchasing Washington's Island, which we saw earlier, in order to achieve this particular goal. Although such a lifestyle would be satisfying, he lamented that it would also be a failure, a way of renouncing his hopes for personal and professional achievement in the United States. The isolated retreat at the heart of this image suggests an escape from the world, a flight from failed homelands past and present. Collection of Small Moonlights offers the illusion of a compelling vision of American homecoming, while also capturing the preoccupations of the immigrant artist who obsesses over European news and frets over American ignorance of current affairs. He meditates on transatlantic connections, and he seeks escape from displacement through a more permanent and self-conscious aesthetic retreat. In his journals of this period, Latrobe described multiple moments in which Virginia and its inhabitants nearly appeared British to him. But each time, he would experience a remarkable moment of undeception, a term Latrobe himself used with fascinating correspondence to Wendy Bellion's analysis of this word in Citizen Spectator. This trompe-l'oeil invites the viewer to experience this jarring circumstance of undeception. Lured toward a promising homeland in America, the viewer nonetheless encounters a landscape rocked by an uncertain international context. Instead of a secure homeland, the image proffers instead the melancholy and stateless life of the hermit. What then can Latrobe's immigrant landscapes contribute to our discussion in these days about the current state of British landscape studies? In consonance with several other speakers, I have focused on landscapes that are peripherally British, in this case through their post-colonial context in Virginia, and or through the perspective of the European artist émigré. Latrobe's Virginian watercolors firmly reject any sense of celebratory American nationalism, but they also don't adopt celebratory British nationalism. They also reckon with Latrobe's sense of displacement. Similarly, these works take into account Latrobe's British subject position and the former colonial status of the landscapes that he represents, even as they focus on undeception, spatial journeys, and the immigrant's sensibility of landscape. Finally, in his innovative techniques of landscape rendering, including the spatial experimentation and trompe-l'oeil I've introduced today, Latrobe suggests ways in which these immigrant images can contribute to our understanding of ambitious landscape painting at the end of the 18th century. Far from the documentary images for which they've been mistaken, Latrobe's studies expect philosophical reflection, close visual scrutiny, and a content-driven analysis. As works that fall outside of the traditional boundaries of both British and American landscape studies, it has taken much too long for our scholarship to catch up with both the perception and the deception of Latrobe's immigrant landscapes.
Thank you both for two very interesting and suggestive papers. I wanted to ask about, in each case, about personal versus public. I mean, in Matthew's case, to what extent do you see, I mean, you were sort of suggesting this, but I'd like you to comment a little more on it, the kind of actuarial practice which you find in churches, sketching methods, actually being carried into his public work. And then Julia, I'd like to just know about Latrobe's intention with these watercolors. I mean, were they done just for his kind of personal pleasure, or the delectation of a kind of intimate group, or did he have some intention beyond that for them? Because I noticed the first two you showed were illustrations for an essay on landscape, which wasn't published, but did he intend it to be published? So Matthew, maybe you could.
Sure. Yeah. My sense is that on a couple different levels, the kind of numeracy that I'm arguing for pervades the public work. And it seems to me that the strategy of the numerate accumulation and harvesting of detail about chromatic information is lodged and recorded and articulated as a means to future production, reutilization of data gathered in the field that can go into the studio production of large-scale exhibition landscape pictures. And that's the sort of alternating cycle of the way that church works between winters in the studio and summers out doing tours and so on and so forth. And so what I see, at least in his sketching program, is a systematization which surely draws upon a number of different conventional forms of annotation, which I'm not saying is either peculiar to him or to to Cole, or to the actuarial schemes of land property annotation that are emergent at this moment. I'm certainly not saying that, but I do think that the way of thinking and working and drawing with numbers that is being practiced is the conditions of possibility for the production of those highly detailed pictures. But I would also say that I think part of what has been so compelling to me about the particular Kuki sketch is the way in which I read that as an image made extremely quickly and aggregating together on a pictorial surface a range of information tied intuitively, graphically, to numerical values, recalled from a previous time, not dictated by what he's seeing at the moment, but recalled from previous time, being keyed into pictorial space, which allows for the reckoning of the drawing of certain types of inferences about the sort of figure who he is encountering and the class status and possible prospects of life, something like this. And it seems to me that that numerate habit of mind has to figure somewhere into the way in which we apprehend this painter who generated such vast numerical sums of capital, of finance, from the retail of his works through these sophisticated contractual and actuarial instruments that ensured its sale, resale, retail, and production, if we think about the insuring of his life and the circulation of his works through insurance.
So with regard to Latrobe, the personal versus public is a really interesting dynamic. Most simply, they are personal for the most part. Even that essay on landscape is something that he wrote for an individual student of his, a young woman, Susanna Catherine Spotswood. But there's been the assertion that he did intend to publish that essay, and possibly pieces from his sketchbooks. He never seems to have made any attempt, and he did have them for the balance of his life. So I don't know that there's much evidence for that, other than the fact that he did publish translations and other works while in London. So he had a history of publishing before he crossed the Atlantic. But what I trace in my book, among other things, is this dynamic where he's using watercolor to kind of reformulate a lot of aspects of his life through this immigrant process, among other things. And by the end of these years I'm looking at, he's integrating this very intellectualized watercolor into manuscripts that are public and intended for his architecture. So booklets he prepares to advertise his architectural work. So I think it is very much part of the public figure Latrobe becomes, but set into the background of his later career.
Good. So, questions from the audience?
A question for Matthew. I'm very interested in numbers as well, and the colour codes, I'm sure you know, go back to at least Dürer, probably earlier. So colour codes with numbers, and those codes get very much taken up by artists who are working with scientists within the imperial age. So this comes to a climax in the very early 19th century with someone like Ferdinand Bauer, who has a colour chart of 1,000 numbers pertaining to individual shades at a very high level. Surely at some part of the point of using these numbers is inherently related to this notion of on-the-spot drawing, saving time to work with a key that then one can later refer to when one has the luxury of working in the studio with a large variety of paint. So I think that element of time and that element of that aspect of really recording views for the purpose of knowledge production within this broader remit of the travelling artist, bringing these views of other nations back to the so-called centres. I think these are all issues that relate to your very interesting paper.
Yeah, thanks. I totally agree. It seems to me that, yeah, you're absolutely right. And again, I'm not trying to suggest that a particular genealogy of British landscape pictures, British Anglo-American landscape painters has any lock on numeric pursuits. Of course not. But I do think that it seems to me that there's room for exploration of the ways in which these proximate connections to insurance practice, which are so close in Church's case, and we know that he uses the instruments of insurance, that he is intimately connected to major figures in the insurance business. It seems to me that there's room for exploration of the way in which a figure like Church might afford us a larger way of apprehending the imbrication of artistic production and circulation with a set of institutions and financial instruments that now govern the circulation and viewing and making and showing of art in such a profound way. And that Church might be a way into that, I guess, is what is of interest to me.
Yeah, Matthew, sorry, to carry on this conversation about the Church's sketches, I wonder what one thing they seem to open up, as much as they might open up interesting comparisons with what was going on in insurance companies, is about the economy of the sketchbook itself within landscape practice. That as much as it is, as you said, about numeracy, it's also about, in this instance at least, many of the examples you showed, a lot of writing, a lot of very interesting combinations of different kinds of sign. And it seems that what this could open up to is a really exciting project which would which would investigate the ways in which sketchbooks work and the economy of a sketchbook that, as you said, is so important to the whole practice that's, as it were, the other half of the studio, the 6 months outside, the winter months and so on. So, and whether it's looking at earlier British examples of the type you showed or exploring these ones by Coland, it's as if there's it's not just a pictorial world, obviously, but a visual world that's remains relatively unexamined as far as I know in terms of modern scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of came at this in part through the language that Church uses to talk about the heart of the Andes in this famous letter describing his dream of exporting it to Berlin, to show it to Alexander von Humboldt. And he claims what the heart of the Andes will give to Humboldt would be a transcript of the scenery that had so enchanted his eyes some decades earlier, which is transcript being language that is, coming out of Asher Durand, coming out of a Ruskinian tradition being exported into the US. And there's been all sorts of work that has elaborated upon the rich imbrications between writing and picture making in the 19th century American tradition. Brian J. Wolf's work, Michael Fried's work in this direction, all sorts of things of this kind that have built upon this close kindred spirit, as it were, between writing and painting. But it seems to me that there's absolutely room for the articulation of what James Elkins calls a domain of images that moves between picture, something like number, and writing, text, that takes into consideration this expanded array of notational form that is not reducible either to picture or writing, but explores the always impure sort of triangulations between them, and an interest in the convertibility of pictures into numbers or numbers into pictures mediated by the presence of text seems to me absolutely essential to Church's sketching practice, to his working up of these giant exhibition pictures, but is also central to the way in which the actuarial drawing practice, the insurance system of going out into the field, producing documentation on building sites, making pictures of them, transferring them back to the home office where they can be converted into numbers, comes to be, and then sent back as rates to be charged on risk premiums to purchasers, comes to be fruitful as a mode of historicizing, of situating these kinds of epistemic investments, and it gives us a sort of way to historicize the ways in which these mixed notational modalities might be brought to bear, taken, used as the stuff of significance and artistic endeavor.
I've got a question for Julia. I'm really enjoying looking at the arc you're tracing from going out into the world and back into the Hermitage, and I suppose relating that to my landmarks in Britain in the 1790s, the most influential poem there is, I suppose, Cooper's The Task, that looking out at the world through the ragged loopholes of retreat, and then that profoundly influences Coleridge's rondo form in the Frost at Midnight. And I just wondered, are those sorts of British poetic models at all important for American or immigrant painters wanting to trace that sort of arc, or is there a completely different sort of American genesis for that rondo shape of out and back?
Certainly, in this period, I know that Latrobe is still very much tied to sources that he read prior to crossing the Atlantic, and he is reading a lot of things in the American context, but there's another trompe-l'oeil watercolor that he makes based on 2 vignettes on the Potomac. And that particular piece is related to the minstrel. So I know that he's very much thinking about epic poetry in the sort of a British context. I don't know that he ever mentions Coleridge, for example, or anything like that. Yeah.
Okay, maybe one more question, and then I think we need to adjourn to lunch back at the Paul Mellon Center.
Just a quick question for Julia. I'm really, I think these are wonderful, these trompe-l'oeil images, and particularly the way they're overlaid over writing, which I think is really fascinating. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about was about what trompe-l'oeil in particular does here, because there's something about trompe-l'oeil that's both deeply social and deeply alienating, and it's both, you know, this very fixed generic form, yet at the same time allows access to the personal in a very precise way. And there are all kinds of games there that I think Lettraux plays with that. You know, for instance, the sort of planetary movement and the way this ties into the kind of short circuit of representation that trompe-l'oeil represents, the fact that it's a watercolor of a watery scene and so on. So I just wondered if, you know, if there's something very specific about trompe-l'oeil that allows him to both reveal and at the same time occlude the specificity of his situation in relation to world historical events, and if that undermines that undergirds this particular choice.
Yes, I think that he's very fascinated with the possibilities of revealing, concealing, and also sharing in very private ways the sorts of ideas he's thinking about. I think he also believes that trompe-l'oeil captures a larger philosophical or poetic set of concerns that he can build up. We do know that he shared his sketchbooks with his friends, and certain of them he seems to have thought of as kindred romantic spirits in the ability to perhaps detect the truths of an image like this. And those people were all fellow European emigres traveling around Virginia or Philadelphia with him. So perhaps there's a certain level at which he thought his American peers would be able to understand an image like this, but they wouldn't get that last step, that only a very small group of people would be able to detect. I don't know if that really answers the breadth of your question. But.
Well, thank you both. And